So we're gonna hop on into our demo for today. So if you haven't already, I encourage you to open up Illustrator and grab your notebook and a pen to take notes on a couple of the keyboard shortcuts we're gonna go through today. And as you're getting started here, you've probably noticed already, this looks very similar to what it looks like whenever you open up Photoshop. Adobe is great at this sort of continuity across their programs. So I'm going to go into Create New to get started, and it's going to give me the opportunity to create something in various formats, various things, here as it slowly opens up. And what I'm going to click on is Print for now. I think makes sense for us to just work with letter-sized documents. Now the thing you're going to notice about Illustrator, and the great thing about it, is that if you are working this way, you can actually print directly from Illustrator to your inkjet printer or your black and white laser printer, and sort of experiment with mock-ups as far as your graphics, as far as your designs, which is kind of a nice perk to working with Illustrator, whereas with Photoshop, these are a lot bigger, more robust file sizes, a lot of different layers, a lot more information. With Illustrator, we're going to talk about momentarily, you're going to find your file sizes are a lot smaller, your information is a lot more compressed and compact. So I'm going to click on a letter size document here, and I'm going to call this, let's see, I'm not going to call it the technical exercise because that's something that you'll be working on separately. So I'm just going to call mine Demo Illustrator Intro. And I'll put my last name and first name to keep it professional here. Great. So down here, you're going to have your width and height notated in points, which is totally fine. If you want it to be in inches so that you know for sure that you're working in artboards that are a print size, that's great. If you're planning on working in Illustrator for your playlist on vinyl project, this is your opportunity to input 12.5 inches by 12.75 inches by 12.75 inches at the size of a vinyl record. And then if you click down Advanced Settings, we're rasterizing at a pretty high rate at 300 ppi. Rasterizing is essentially how Illustrator looks at the images and graphics you're making and thinks about them in terms of if you were going to print it. But differently than Photoshop, you're going to notice that you have a lot more opportunity to scale after the fact, as opposed to being limited by the number of pixels that you're starting with as you would if you're using a digital image. So color mode, I can turn this from CMYK, which would be one print mode that's optimized for graphical. I can turn it to RGB. It's going to give me a little like, uh-oh, and that's because print-wise, a lot of more graphical content is printed with the CMYK color mode, whereas more photographic content is printed with an RGB color mode. So I'm going to hit create. We're going to rock and roll with RGB, but if you want to try it out in CMYK, you can too. We can always bring it into Photoshop and convert it later. So I hit create, and it should pull up a couple of, or not a couple, but maybe a workspace here. An artboard to get started, and I'll take the survey later here. And now I have a workspace. Of course, it's going to give me some options. If you want to work through and take a look at that tutorial, you're more than welcome to on your own. So there's a couple of panels that I really like having around in Illustrator that make things easier to see for me. And those two things are layers and artboards. I see that in my Essentials workspace, which is up here, it has a whole bunch of different workspaces. You might find that one works better for you than others. But what I like to do is start with the Essentials workspace and then start customizing it based on what I use most frequently. So I know for sure that I have a layers panel. Looks familiar and does operate very similar to Photoshop. The one thing you can do with your layers that's even more important in this program as opposed to Photoshop is you can actually lock them. So we're going to talk about that in a bit. But the other thing I want to make sure that I can see in my workspace are my artboards, and I'm not seeing that in my Essentials workspace. So that's one that I'm going to want to add. I'm going to go up to Window here, and you can note all of these different panels that are options for how to manipulate your graphics here. I'm going to click on Artboards. Now if I want to add this to my workspace, I can drop it in here, I can drop it up here. It's totally up to you, however you want to work or whatever works best based off of the size of your screen. But what's great about Artboards, and this is something that Illustrator can do that Photoshop cannot do, is that you can have multiple workspaces going on simultaneously. So right now I have one artboard, like one sheet of paper that I'm working on, but I have the option of adding another artboard if I come down to this little plus sign. It'll give me another workspace. And this is not infinitely expandable, but it is expandable pretty far. As far as, you know, I've had maybe 50 or 60 different artboards working at the same time. I tend to lose track if I have that many going simultaneously. But what's great about it is that as you're developing an idea or working on a concept or want to see 3 concepts all next to each other, you have the opportunity of adding workspaces as you go. If I click on Artboard 1, it highlights 2, 3, etc. So we're going to talk about some more shape-related things in Illustrator here momentarily, but I'm going to use a little type toolbox, similar to Photoshop, of course, to go over some information with you guys about what's different between the tools that you're going to get out of Illustrator versus Photoshop. So I'm going to grab my character or type window. It's called type in Illustrator. And then I'm going to go over to character. There we go. And I can mount this workspace over here if I want. And I can compress these panels as well. And then I'll change my font to Helvetica, so it's a little easier to read here, and I can adjust my font, of course. All right, so here's a few differences between vectors versus pixels. So this is important. Understanding the difference between these is going to help you be able to identify which program you should be working in based on what you're trying to accomplish. Vectors are the basic building blocks of Illustrator. They are very different from pixels, which, of course, as you could probably tell, I was going to go in this direction here. Pixels are the basic building blocks of Photoshop. And quite honestly, because you can do so much with both of them, I would say neither of them is all that basic, but that's just me. Joke. So, basic building blocks of Illustrator versus basic building blocks of Photoshop. We know that pixels are dots. We measure them as dots per inch, DPI, or pixels per inch, PPI. We know that pixels are short for picture element. Picture element is actually the acronym, or pixels is an acronym for picture element. That's where that word comes from. You can impress your friends with that one. And we also know that we have to measure pixels in terms of resolution. Generally speaking, when we're working with pixels, we're talking about a digital photograph, a scan, or a digital image, something that has finite boundaries, As you notice, we can't scale up too much before losing quality, stretching pixels out. And all of those are some of the qualifiers for pixels. We push them around in Photoshop. We push them around in Lightroom if you're editing photos. Not doing that in this class specifically, but those are a couple of like high-end pixel pushing programs that we talk about in terms of Adobe software. Pixels, really, if you are doing editing, you might see terms like HDR or high dynamic range, which means there's a lot of them. When your photographer friends are talking about editing images that have a high dynamic range, they're generally talking about images that have a lot of pixels. So, yeah. Why is a vector different? Well, instead of it being a dot, a DPI, a PPI, a vector is actually more of a line-based asset, and it is based on an algorithm, meaning that we're looking at math or mathematical formulas. In order to scale up or scale down infinitely. So we talk about vectors as being infinitely scalable. Now, whereas with pixels, you would use a pixel or see a pixel in a scan or a digital image. A vector is what you're going to want to use for a graphic, a logo, something you'd want to scale up or down one way or another. And vectors make that easy. For example, if you go to a couple of Google image searches, oh yeah, that's the recipe that I'm making for dinner tonight. Oprah's turkey burger recipe, highly recommend. You can look it up like that. If you come over to DePaul logos, Google image search, now what you're looking at in Google Images is obviously these are all pixel-based graphics, but the idea is whenever the person who designed the DePaul logo designed it, they knew that they would want it to be able to be printed on a super teeny tiny on a pencil that you buy from the school store, but they'd also want it to be big enough to expand to be billboard size, like all these billboards we've seen in and around Chicago, because that's the use of a logo. It has to be infinitely scalable, whereas even with a huge sensor size in your camera or taking pictures on large format film and then scanning them, there will always be a limitation. Whereas with vectors and vector graphics, you have the opportunity to scale super small or super large, which is awesome and super useful. So the program that we use to push vectors around, we're going to be using Illustrator, but of course there are other programs, especially used by game designers, for example, that utilize vectors to create characters or environments or scenes. So programs like Unity, Maya, CAD, a lot of vector pushing software is utilized in the architecture realm, video game design, graphics, but vectors are the term that we use to talk about those, and that's what we're going to be pushing around today as opposed to pixels. So I'm going to keep this up. Hopefully you have this down in your notes. I'm not writing this on a whiteboard like I would do in class, so bear with me. Cool. So the thing we're going to look at today are primarily using your shapes and excuse me, I am all over the place today. We're going to be using shapes in order to create various images in Illustrator. So obviously we have our selection tool, which, and we have our text tool that I was just using. The selection tool allows you to move something around. I typed up all of this text for this mini lecture all on layer 1, which you'll see is notated as blue up here. Now everything that I create shape-wise on layer 1 is also going to highlight as blue whenever I use my mouse over it. So let's take a look at a couple of things you can do with shapes. We're going to talk about the direct selection tool here in a few minutes. And I'm actually going to skip over the pen tools at first because even though these are first up on your toolbar list and they're very useful, they're also a little bit more difficult to use than straight up shapes. So that's where we're going to start. I'm going to grab, let's start with the ellipse tool. You can also, while you're on this, hit L and you'll get the opportunity to create an ellipse. And down here, we have something that looks very similar to our foreground and background color in Photoshop, but these are actually going to correspond to the fill and the stroke of any given shape that we create. So right now, the fill is going to be black, and the stroke, or the outline, is going to be X. If I hold down the Shift key and I draw my circle, sure enough, the fill is black and the stroke is nothing. There's no outline around it. Now I can double click on this and change the fill if I'm feeling like it's a hot pink kind of a day. I can also add a stroke if I want, just by double clicking on that little panel and finding the color that makes me feel happy and summery. And you might notice, like, oh, you changed the color with the stroke, but you really can't see it. Well, there's another window for that. This is one you might want to write down, especially if it's not coming up initially in your essentials window. So I'm going to go to Window and click on Appearance. Window Appearance. And I am going to throw that right up here next to my artboards because it's something that I know I'm going to be coming back to a lot. Sure enough, as long as this is selected, I'm getting my information on how thick my stroke is and my fill. And of course, I have the opportunity to continue modifying the color there. It's not as easy to get to as opposed to just double clicking down here. You're going to have a lot more color options. That's what I'm going to recommend you do to get there a little bit more efficiently. But the appearance window does allow you the option to increase your stroke size. So I can give it a nice thick exterior outline at 25 points, which is pretty cool, or a little bit less than that. It also gives you the option in my Appearances panel to alter my opacity here if I want it to be more see-through. Grab my V from my Move tool, and now I can sort of see through that graphic. Or I can just use that lowered opacity as a slightly more sorbet version of that shape. Here's another fun shortcut you can try out as well as you're working on building things. If I hold down my Option key, my Alt key, and click on this shape and then pull away from it, I can actually create a duplicate fairly easily. And if I hold down my Shift key, of course, I can maintain that aspect ratio on my shape as well. And now I have cute little overlapping circles. I can make another one and another one. And now I'm like creating a graphic for someone's like relaxing bubble bath or something. It's amazing. So it's quite easy to duplicate things as you're working through Illustrator as far as shapes. And of course, if I don't necessarily want my shape to be a perfect circle, I can always create one at any size or scale. And what's great about this, those of you who felt limited by the fact that you couldn't scale infinitely up and down in Photoshop, here in Illustrator, you are liberated because these little lines, and I'm going to zoom in and get super close here, these are vectors around the outside. This is an infinite line with an infinite number of points or dots, theoretically. So I can expand this as large as a billboard or as small as pencil without losing any kind of image quality, which is awesome. Now I'm going to show you a couple of interesting things you can do just by utilizing shapes, especially if you're the kind of person who's like, no, I need this graphic to be a perfect circle or a perfect shape. I need this to really work out for me. So I'm going to keep on my circle tool here, but instead of having it with a fill, I think I'm actually going to say no fill just by clicking this little strike through button here. And for my stroke, I'm going to give it just a black slim stroke here. And then I'm going to hold down my shift key, take my stroke in my appearances panel down to maybe 1 point, just enough so that I can see what I'm doing here. And I'll zoom in so you can get a good look at the move I'm going to make here. What I really like about working with shapes is that you can make a lot of different shapes by building them one from another. So I'll show you what I mean. I'm going to go ahead and make a copy of this circle here. And now I have these two overlapping circles. And if you look closely, this actually gives me the opportunity to create or make 3 different shapes. There's this like crescent moon shape up here, there's a reflection of that crescent moon over here, and then there's that middle spot in the, right between the two. So I'm going to drag a box over this whole thing. I definitely need both of them to be selected. You know, I can move them around together while they're both selected, which is pretty cool. But I need them both to be selected in order for this next thing to work. So you might, if you are working along with me, maybe watch this time through and then try it on your own. I'm going to go over here to my Shape Builder tool. It looks like 2 circles overlapping, just like what we're doing. You can also get to Shape Builder by hitting Shift M, and it brings me over to that tool. Now you'll notice as I'm hovering over my different objects here, they kind of glow gray. And I can separate them out from each other as long as they're glowing gray by doing this. I'm going to simply click on my first little crescent moon shape here. I'm going to click on my middle shape here. And I'm going to click on my other crescent moon shape over here. Now what I need to do is click off of that with my regular selection tool, so I can hit V and click off. And now, if I click on my path, this little vector around my ellipse here, I can pull it out, and it is now officially its own shape, which is pretty cool. If I want to rotate that, I can do this as I'm putting my shape composition together. So this becomes really interesting because I have the opportunity to create a lot of new shapes with, you know, a perfect line or whatever from my original circles or squares or ellipses or whatever that might be. As long as I have all of them selected, and then I go to my Shape Builder tool, and I can even connect shapes with this tool as well. So if I draw a line that starts here, you can kind of see it, and it's glowing red. It says, yay, you picked me. I can then connect those, grab my arrow tool here, and I can move this away, and now all of a sudden I've connected these shapes into one thing that kind of looks like a, I don't know, a crab claw or something, like maybe a really good starting sketch to make up your own Pokemon, whatever that might be. This guy is still very, very separate. Yeah, but why not? Let's do it. Let's create a little creature that has asymmetrical ears. It could be that. It could be an earring design. It could be a lot of different things, you know, like with vectors. Ooh, this could be very cool. With vectors, what you can do is put them through a 3D printer and print these designs. So if you're like, ooh, yeah, I could definitely use a little bit of extra money over the quarantine times, maybe consider, you know, designing something really interesting and marketable using Illustrator and then having a company 3D print it. So let's do it. Let's go from here. So this is maybe my earring design or whatever, and I included this as its own shape on top of this area. So if I want this to be, for example, transparent, it currently isn't, and I can show you that it's not by pulling it over here. Ooh, I don't know. It is transparent because we never added a fill. But if I want this to be its own transparent shape, Command Z here, what I can do is use the Shape Builder tool a final time, click this guy, so it's its own shape, click this guy, and then if I delete this, I know for a fact that this should be a see-through shape. Yeah, definitely. So cool. And if I, let's say, pull this over, yep, the whole thing is moving. And I can add a fill to it. Let's say a cool gold, yellow type thing. Awesome. And here you go. You have a pair of earrings. If I hold down that Option key, or maybe it's, you know, someone's hockey team logo design. Not exactly sure. What's great about Illustrator also is that once you do build out these shapes, very similar to Photoshop, I can go into Object. It's not in Edit this time in Illustrator, but I can go to Object, Transform, I can reflect it, Angle. Let's just say a vertical flip, Preview. I can see what that looks like. Hit OK, and now I have two different earrings that are sort of split across that surface, which is kind of cool. Or man, maybe now they're like owl eyes, which could also be an interesting way to go with this design. So let's see. Let's make his face a little bit smaller. Let's go for it. So if I had to design an owl with these eyes as a starting point, and honestly guys, I am totally making this up as I go. I am not an illustrator or a designer as much as I am a photographer and a photo editor, so bear with me, but I have done a fair amount of work in the program. The first thing I want to do is I'm going to lock layer 1, which is where everything is so far. And I'm going to create a face for this owl, and I'm going to put that on a different layer because I don't want these ones to move. So I'm going to come down here to the little plus sign. I know it's really hard to see in Adobe. And layer 2 right now is sitting on top of layer 1, but I want it behind because I want the eyeballs to be on top. So I'm going to pull that back there. And let's see, we'll give them a circular head, I think. I'll give them yeah. And I'm going to hold down the Shift key. Maybe it'll be like a whole circular body situation. And what's really great about Illustrator, you're noticing probably, it's just lining everything up really, really nicely. Knowing that these are his eyes, and this is his the back of him, let's let's change this to a more owl-centric brown orange. Oops, that did not work. I need to have it selected. There we go. And then maybe what I'll do is make these as the eyes. So I'm going to create another little series of circles here. And for these ones, I'm going to fill them in with black. But you're probably going to notice here that they end up being, nope, they are on top. That's so cool. They did end up on top. That's wonderful. And then I will copy another one over. Cute. And now, so it doesn't look like he has dead eyes, I'll just, I don't know, if it's just all black eyes, it's gonna look kind of funny. So I'll give him a little glint in each of the eyes as well. Command plus to zoom in. And then I'll grab this guy, hold down my Option key so I can copy them over. Cute. And this is all now on layer 2. So I can turn off layer 1. Oh, speaking of Pokemon, now he kind of looks like a circular Diglett. That's really weird. Layer 2, and I can add, you know, a beak to him if I want, or a little nose. You know, I might need to pull out the pen tool for that to make it super exact. I'll just give him a circular nose for now. I don't know what kind of animal this is anymore. Maybe it's a squirrel. I don't know. So anyway, there's a lot you can do with shapes and the shape builder tool. I'm going to add another artboard here, and I'm going to show you how this is going to become even more useful for us as we move forward. I'm going to give this creature a little home of sorts by creating another artboard, but I'll be able to copy over my creature to the new space here momentarily. I'm going to make another layer just so that I have the opportunity to lock it, and my layer 3 I'm going to pull all the way to the background. On layer 3 I'm going to grab the rectangle tool, and again I'm trying to do everything with only shapes today. Keep things interesting. And this is going to be my background. I'm probably not going to use a pink background. I think I'm going to add more of a blue background. So I'm going to come over here and change my fill to be maybe a blue purple. Cool. Another thing that you can do as far as appearances for your shapes that you're creating in Illustrator is you can add a gradient. Now, while I have my shape selected here, I'm going to come over to the gradient tool, or G, and see if this works. If I create a line, is anything happening? No, nothing's happening. So if this happens to you, what I can do is come up to Window, grab Gradient, and now I'm going to have a lot more flexibility as far as what this tool can do, and then I can go pick up my process by clicking it over here on the toolbar a little bit later. But let's start with the preset, and then I'll show you how you can start to edit it. Okay, so this is like way different from where we started, but I can show you that there's quite a few different ways to alter it and change it by modifying this little line over here You can modify where your color transitions over here. You can flip it to be at a 90-degree angle, which would be closer to where we were before, to where it's going vertically instead. And then I can double click on any of my gradients and create my own gradient spectrum if I want, which is going to get me to that deep, rich blue purple, or, you know, maybe it goes to a sort of pink sorbet thing. Not bad. So this becomes my background in this case. And then I can slide them around or add another color by clicking on these up here. And I can eliminate any given color by clicking on it and then just literally pulling it off of the slider. So I'm just going to click on it and then drag down and it goes away. I can add another one by clicking it in and something comes back, and I can modify the color of any of those gradients at any time. Now, if you're a fan of 90s art and 90s graphics, which have made a comeback with the vaporwave culture, etc., and you just want to do some silly, crazy gradients, go for it. But also note that gradients have this inherent connection with the world of, you know, early Microsoft Word art, etc. So, you know, just something to be aware of. But this gradient's looking pretty good for my background. So what I'm going to do is draw a box over my creature here. Now you notice his little ears didn't select because layer 1 is locked. I'm going to unlock layer 1. I'm going to lock layer 3 because whatever I do not want this background to move anywhere as I'm building up my images. But now that these layers are unlocked, great, they're all selecting. So now I can hold down the Option key and pull them over on top of my gradient here and resize them, do anything I want. As I keep working on him, I can give him legs and maybe, you know, a smile or something cute like that. I have no idea what this creature is anymore. But now I've very much created a creature and a background, which is kind of cool. And the great thing about using layers is, let's say my background is layer 3, but I want to make sure he has a little bubble bath going on behind him. Oops, don't want to do that. I'm going to lock the creature and the background, and on this new layer that I've created, I can grab my bubbles. Oh, they are locked. I can grab the bubbles like this, and I'm going to hit Command C to copy them. And then I'm going to come over to layer 4, relock layer 1, and then I'm going to hit Edit, Paste in Place. Aha. Hold on, let's change this to maybe be a different color here on layer 4 so I know for sure that it's not blue. Should have that option. Maybe not, but I do know that this is on layer 4. Maybe I can put it on layer 5 for a different color here. Layer 5 is like a pink. So we're going to get rid of layer 4 here. I'm going to hit Edit, Paste in Place. Cool. So now you can see it as being on the magenta colored layer 5. And then I will pull it over here. With all of the awesome different opacity options going on. And I can resize things as I want. Hold down the Shift key. and, you know, build up a cool space. The other thing you can do as far as appearances is if you are clicked on one of your assets, one of your objects, you can go over to your Appearances tab. And in addition to opacity over here, which I had already changed to be 54% when we first started, I can also give it a different blending mode, just like in Photoshop. So depending on what you're layering on top of what, it might make sense to experiment with some of your options as far as your blending modes are concerned. And this gets even more fun when, let's say, your fill is minty green and your stroke is, we'll go totally different, like a blue. This one will have more of a cool shades thing going on. I can change my opacity. I can change my blending mode to be something really interesting. So it's going to interact with everything in a pretty unique way. Kind of like that. After this demo, I'm going to have to spend some time actually finishing this one. This is pretty cute. Cool. So I absolutely encourage you guys to experiment with those options as you're moving forward through the shape building process. You can build up shapes, you can distill shapes, etc. Here's a fun one to just review a couple of things. I'm going to add another artboard, and I'm going to grab my ellipse tool again, and this time I'm going to keep my fill at white, and I'm going to give it a little stroke. And I'm going to make one big circle. Let's go ahead and take down in my appearances panel how big that stroke actually is. But if you've ever seen a yin yang, you can actually build out this form by just using circles, which is one of the reasons why it's considered to be such a Zen shape or a Zen thing. So if you start with one big circle and then you add two additional circles, I'm going to hit the V button. What's great about Illustrator is you're noticing I'm watching where these are lining up so that I can hit the midpoint of the circle here. I have my intersect, like everything is kind of snapping into showing me how close I am to getting it exactly perfect at that intersect point. I'm so close. Make it just a tiny bit bigger. And then option click. It was a little bit too big. I just barely want them to be touching. So this is my starting point. If I do this perfectly, my two circles on the inside are exactly half the size of my starting circle, and they're positioned touching exactly at that middle radius point within my bigger circle. And now, and by the way, everything's pink because I'm on layer 5. If I click over the whole thing and grab my shape builder tool, okay, so these are still not entirely separated. So what I'm going to do is just double, triple confirm that I have intersected the exterior here. Here we go. Cool. So now they're disparate shapes. So if I do this and connect these two with my shape builder tool, and I do this and connect these two with my shape builder tool, I didn't do it perfectly, obviously. You can see I have a little bit of space right here, but the idea is you could, hypothetically, from here, build your own yin yang, which then again, if I did want to kind of fudge this and correct it, I could totally do that by selecting the whole thing. I'm going to grab my shape builder tool, grab this little piece, drag it down over here. It's close. It's not perfect. But I think this is a good example of how powerful your tools in Illustrator can be. So again, it's not perfect, but concept, it's there. So I'm going to add another artboard and show you guys one more interesting thing that you can experiment with. We've talked about so far, there's my turkey burger recipe again. We've talked so far about layers, locking layers, artboards. We've talked about creating shapes and utilizing the shape building tool. We talked a bit about stroke, fill, your selection tool. We haven't talked about the direct selection tool yet. We may or may not get to that one today, but I do want to show you how to create a pattern, and I want to show you how to export from Illustrator, because I think as far as blending modes, building shapes, creating things, you're going to have a lot of opportunity of things to experiment with without even breaking into the pen tool or the curvature tool, which we'll be getting more into next week. Of course, you're more than welcome to start experimenting with them now if you'd like. So the pattern idea that I was talking about here briefly. Let's say I create an interesting design, like maybe we'll start with one of our ellipses here, and I need to unlock that layer in order to grab it. I'm just going to pull it over to another artboard by kind of dragging across the surface here. I could also zoom out if I wanted to. But let's say we want a cool sort of moon themed pattern. Let's create something that we could maybe use for this that might be interesting. I'll create a little moon. No stroke. And I'll fill it with, let's do a sort of spring themed pattern here. And then maybe I'll grab a couple of these objects and hold down the Shift key to select multiples. So I'm just holding that down to select them. I'm going to Option, click them over. Oops. Option, drag them over. There we go. And I'm going to give these ones a sort of softer exterior here, so they're not quite as intense. That blue is like super graphical for me right now, so I'm going to soften that up a bit. It's the springtime, so we need spring themes and stuff. Be great. Pull this down. Maybe lighten this guy up a bit. Yeah, that's a little bit better. Maybe I'll lighten this guy as well. I'm not going to obsess over it too much. Can change the opacity of my stroke and the opacity of my fill here. Great. So I can really significantly work on modifying some of these elements. And let's say this is the pattern piece that I want to start with. What I'm going to do is actually make the whole thing a bit smaller. Well, changes it a bit, that's okay. I can always go back and adjust my strokes if I want to scale it down without it affecting that. There is a way to do that as well. I'm forgetting off the top of my head, but for our intents and purposes, let's say this is where we want to start with our pattern. So I'm going to select over all of those shapes and go to Object, Pattern, Make. And it's going to eventually be added to the swatches panel once I get done creating it. But I have a lot of different options as far as, that's very cool, how I'd like that to be placed. So this is looking pretty awesome. But I can also make it a little bit closer. And that really abstracts things pretty significantly. Or a little bit further away, like if my pattern was like all these cute little foxes and I wanted that on a shirt or something. I think I have like strange animals on my mind because I totally found this like massively fat or pregnant squirrel in my garage, and it's been haunting me in my dreams. So now we're getting a bit closer to you know, maybe what we'd want to see in a pattern here. I can also, you know, look at it with even more copies going on here. And then I can call this my springtime abstract pattern. And what's great is now in my swatches board, that pattern is going to come up. Now, if you're ever in this window and you're like, how do I get back to where I'm supposed to be working? It's going to happen to you all at some point. You're going to click something and you're going to be like, what? Why can't I do anything? Why is nothing working? Just click this little arrow up here, because right now I'm in the pattern editing mode, which I need to get out of. So I'm going to click this little back arrow and boom, we're back to where we were. So let's say I want to put this pattern to use. I'm going to make another artboard and create a shape, make a rectangular shape, and I can fill it now from my swatches panel. Ooh, I actually just filled the stroke. That's cool. I'm going to flip them, so yep, there we go. But I can also fill with the stroke as well, which is kind of awesome. And there you have it. A whole pattern being applied to a background, which is kind of awesome. And then the pattern will sort of expand with the format that I'm placing it inside of. And if you're like, oh, that's great, but it's like way too big, again, this is a space to experiment with sizing your original based on what you're going to be doing and trying things out as far as modifying your stroke and your graphical elements and how those things are working together. Cool. So we've gone over several different things. You might have noticed that when I was working in Illustrator, I wasn't nearly as great about labeling things. With artboards, I tend not to label them just because they pop up in order and I have an idea of the progression of my design or idea. And then layers, I can absolutely label them as well if I really want to have that extra layer of organization. So I could call this one my background. Color, I could call this my bubbles. I can change the color, which I was trying to do earlier and slipped my mind how to do that. I can, depending on what's on each layer. But it's kind of up to you. Certain projects necessitate that you label them, but other projects in Illustrator I found it's not quite as important to label the layers because there's, you can kind of tell what's in them, and then many times if you expand your layer, it's going to show you all of the different vector components that comprise that given layer. So something to be aware of. We did not today talk about the direct selection tool or the pen tools or the uses for those, but I'd like to come back to that next week to talk a bit further. The direct selection tool is something you can use if you want to modify. Specifically, I can move this out of the way also. The direct selection tool allows you to modify specifically your paths, which are these, and your anchor points. So if you double click on any given anchor point, it gives you the opportunity to dramatically scale things. You can also add anchor points as you're putting together, a given shape. So your direct selection tool is going to allow you the flexibility to change any given shape pretty dramatically, pretty severely. But any of these given anchor points, you can always modify. Now, since we are on the topic, and I've very much changed how this looks. This is my awesome L logo. Here's another way that you can modify shapes that might even feel a little bit more, oh, you know what? No, we're not going to talk about that till we talk about the curvature tool. Getting a little bit ahead of myself. But anchor points are essentially exist on the path, and that allows you to kind of change the shape. So all of that being said, let's talk about how to wrap it up. We're going to save this document. I'm going to go into File, Save As. If I haven't already hit my file save at any given point in time, I'm just going to save my copy on the desktop for now, but I would encourage you to save yours in a safe spot on your computer. Saving all my artboards, great. But obviously, when you're turning in your 3 different artboards or your shape compositions, you're going to be turning them in as JPEGs. And we just saved an AI file, which is like a PSD file, which is not something you'll be turning in. So what I'm going to do is go into File, Export, and then export for screens. I find that this is the easiest way and most straightforward way to export your work in multiple different ways all at the same time. So right now I have all my artboards selected, but if I only wanted to turn in artboard 7, artboard 4, and artboard 1, for example, which is my text from the lecture today, I could also de-check a bunch of the other artboards that might just be process work. And then what I want to do is make sure I have include bleed selected, and then I need to choose the folder where I'm going to be saving these artboards. And they're all going to be separate from each other. I'll go to my desktop. I'm going to make a new folder called Shape Compositions. Obviously yours will be very different as you continue working after our demo today and getting comfortable with Illustrator. So that's going to pop up as Shape Compositions. I'll hit Choose. And I do want it to create subfolders because I'm going to export these in a couple of different ways. The first version I'll hit is 1 times as large, means, yeah, that's going to be your 8.5 by 11 inch at 300 dpi PNG. And what we're doing is essentially turning vectors into pixels at this point. But we happen to have a lot of different sizing options. We can make this 4 times as big PNG, which would be super awesome. In fact, let's do it. In fact, I'm going to grab this guy too, and I'll show you how he looks as a PNG as well. We'll do another. I'm going to make this a JPEG 100. Always select JPEG 100. It's the highest quality. And I'll scale this to just being 1 times as big. That's fine. 2 times as big. And then I know that I'm exporting as both PNG and JPEG all in the same stroke here. So I'm going to hit export. Oh, well, if you wanted to, you can add an additional scale. We have JPEGs, PNGs, SVG. We'll deal with this when we get to the typography exercise. It can also export as a PDF, but if I decide I don't want that extra one, I'll just hit the X button and that'll go away. I'll go to Export Artboard. And there you go, Shape Compositions. I have my JPEGs in here. And I have my PNGs in here. Now, you notice my PNGs, what's great about these is that they're like JPEGs except they don't have a background, which is really helpful for logos. So for example, if I wanted to take this little guy and who I exported as a PNG and put him on the screen here, I could go find him right here, open with Photoshop, and you're going to get this 0 background situation, which becomes so useful. Hit Command C to copy, and then Command V to paste, and you notice it's actually pretty good size here. And I can set them right there in the middle of a photographic thing, which is kind of cool. It's a Pokemon in the wild. You could collect. It's great. I mean, AR is getting so realistic these days. Anyway, so that is how you export, how you deal with shapes and shape modification in Illustrator. I would encourage you guys to push yourselves as, you know, as what you feel like is fun and exciting as far as working with those different word prompts to create 3 different artboards that correspond back to each of those selected words here. Melancholy, exuberance, isolation, lackadaisical, peppy, pick 3 and create 3 artboard compositions. Spend, about an hour max on creating these, and then turn in your 3 JPEGs to your technical exercises folder in Google Drive.